The first thing I noticed was the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and steady inside a chamber that was not built for a human chest. I opened my eyes to a soft blue light pressing down on me from every direction, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. Then the cold of the floor beneath my back told me otherwise. I was lying inside some kind of enclosed pod, the walls curved and smooth, humming faintly with a current I could feel more than hear. My hands were free, my legs were free. Nothing was holding me down except the low gravity that made every movement feel half a second slower than it should. I did not move right away. Years of training told me that the first thing you do when you wake up somewhere strange is nothing at all. You listen, you watch, you let your body finish waking up before you let anyone else know you are awake. Through the curved wall of the pod, shapes moved. Tall, narrow figures, draped in pale robes that seemed to shift color, depending on how the light hit them. Their movements were slow and deliberate, almost gentle. I counted 4 of them before I stopped counting and started listening instead. They were speaking, but not in any language I recognized. It was not sound exactly, more like pressure changes in the air, a rhythm that pulsed rather than spoke. And yet, strangely, I understood pieces of it, fragments. Words like specimen and fragile and contained surfaced in my mind, as if something inside my own skull was translating for me, stitching their pressure language into English, one broken phrase at a time. I lifted 2 fingers to the side of my neck and felt a small ridge just beneath the skin, no bigger than a grain of rice. An implant, not mine. Someone had put it there while I was unconscious. That was the moment fear should have taken over. Instead, something colder and more useful settled into my chest. Calculation. I made myself breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I had been trained to do when the body wanted to panic and the mind needed to work. I let my eyes move without turning my head. The pod I was in had a seam along the top, faint but visible, likely an emergency release. Beyond the tall figures, I could see a wider room, dim and vast, lined with control panels that glowed with soft amber light. Cables ran along the ceiling like veins. Somewhere far off, a low mechanical pulse repeated every few seconds, steady as a second heartbeat. Engines. This was a ship. One of the tall figures noticed my eyes were open and made a sound, sharp and quick, that made the others turn. I kept my face calm. I let my shoulders relax, even as every muscle beneath them stayed coiled and ready. If they thought I was afraid, they would treat me differently than if they thought I was a threat. Right now, afraid was safer. Afraid bought me time. The seam along the top of the pod split apart with a quiet hiss, and cool air rushed in, carrying a scent like ozone and something faintly metallic. One of the figures leaned closer, and for the first time I saw its face clearly. Smooth, hairless, with wide dark eyes that had no visible pupil, just a deep, endless black. Its mouth was small, almost an afterthought beneath those eyes. It did not look cruel. It looked curious, in the way a person looks at an animal they have never seen before. "Do not be afraid," the pressure language said, and my implant turned it into English a half-second later. The voice, if it could be called that, was gentle. "You are safe here." I let my eyes widen slightly, let my breathing catch, just enough to look like fear rather than the readiness that was actually coursing through me. I had learned a long time ago that being underestimated was not a weakness. It was a weapon, and it was often the only one you had left. "Where am I?" I asked, and my own voice sounded rough, unused, though I did not know how long I had been unconscious. "You are aboard a Vale research vessel," the creature said. "We found your small craft adrift. It was badly damaged. You were the only survivor." The word survivor landed strangely in my chest. I let it sit there without reacting. "How long?" I asked. "Time enough for your body to heal from what it endured," the creature said. "You have been unconscious for what your species would call several days." Several days. I filed that away and said nothing else for a moment, letting my gaze drift slowly around the room again, cataloging without appearing to catalog. 2 guards, if that was what they were, stood near a wide door on the far side of the chamber, arms crossed in a posture that read as watchful even across species. A 3rd figure worked at a console, occasionally glancing back toward me with the same curious, careful expression as the one speaking to me now. A 4th stood slightly apart from the others, closer to the door, its robe a darker shade than the rest, and something about the way it held itself told me it was the one making the decisions here. "You've been very kind," I said, letting my voice tremble just slightly at the edges. "I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand any of this." "That is understandable," the creature said, and something in its tone softened further, as if my apparent confusion had confirmed something it already believed about me. "You have suffered a great deal. Rest now. We only wish to understand you, and to help you." I nodded slowly, letting my eyes fall half closed, playing the part of someone too exhausted and frightened to think clearly. Inside, my mind was moving fast, mapping every exit, every console, every place a body could hide, or a hand could reach a weapon. The seam of the pod, the distance to the wide door, the rhythm of the guards' movements, slow, almost lazy, the movements of people who had never once been given a reason to expect resistance. They thought I was trapped. They thought I was small, and frightened, and fragile, a fragment of wreckage they had pulled from the dark and were now gently studying, the way you might study an injured bird before releasing it back into the sky. They had no idea what I had been trained for. They had no idea what world I came from, or what it had cost humanity to survive it. Out there, past the edges of any star chart these creatures had ever drawn, there were things that did not ask questions before they attacked. There were things that had taught my species, generation after generation, that hesitation was the fastest way to die. I had grown up learning to read a room the way other children learn to read books. I had grown up learning that the moment you assumed you were safe was the moment you stopped being safe. So even as I let my body go soft and my voice go small, even as I let them believe I was exactly what they expected, I was already working through the layout of the ship in my mind. The hum of the engines told me its size, larger than a scout, smaller than a full warship. The amber consoles told me its age, old enough to have been refit more than once. The careful, gentle way these Veil moved told me something else too, something that mattered more than any of it. They were not used to fear. They were not used to resistance. Whatever this ship was here to do, it had not expected to meet anything that could push back. That told me two things. Either they were telling the truth, and this really was nothing more than a quiet research vessel that had stumbled onto wreckage in the dark, or they were far more dangerous than they were letting on, confident enough in their own strength that they had never once considered needing to prepare for someone like me. I intended to find out which. "Can I have some water?" I asked, letting my voice crack slightly on the last word. The lead creature, the one who had spoken to me first, made a soft sound of assent and gestured to the one at the console. A moment later, a small container was brought to me, filled with something clear that smelled faintly sweet. I drank slowly, watching over the rim of the container, as the darker-robed figure near the door finally moved, crossing the room with slow, measured steps until it stood close enough that I could see the faint patterns etched into the fabric of its robe, symbols I did not recognize but that looked, unmistakably, like some kind of rank. "You are conscious now," it said, and its voice carried differently than the others, lower, slower, deliberate in a way that suggested every word had been chosen with care. "That is good. We have many questions." "I have some of my own," I said quietly, setting the container down beside me. The dark-robed figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity, or might have been something closer to surprise. The two guards near the door shifted their weight, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. "You are in no condition to make demands," the figure said, not unkindly, but firmly, the way you might correct a child who had misunderstood the rules of a game. "I'm not making demands," I said, and I let my eyes come up to meet that endless black gaze, directly for the first time since I had woken. I let every trace of fear drain out of my voice, just for a moment, just long enough for them to notice the shift. "I only want to know one thing, and I think you owe me an honest answer." The room went very still. Even the low pulse of the engines seemed to fade into the background. "Ask," the dark-robed figure said, after a pause that lasted a beat too long. I held its gaze, and I let the question fall into the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. "Are you here to study us?" I asked. "Or are you here to decide whether we're worth destroying? Because I need to know which one I'm dealing with, and I think you need to decide which one you actually are." Nobody in that room moved for a long moment. The guards near the door straightened, The figure at the console turned fully around, its dark eyes fixed on me with an expression I could not read but did not need to, because the silence itself was answer enough. I had asked a question they had not expected a frightened, fragile survivor to ask. And in the space of that silence, I watched every one of them begin, quietly, to reconsider exactly what it was they had pulled out of the dark. The dark-robed figure recovered first, though I watched it take a full second longer than it probably wanted to admit. Its posture straightened, the loose fabric of its robe settling around narrow shoulders as it composed itself. "That is a strange question for someone so recently pulled from wreckage," it said carefully. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's the only question that actually matters right now." The two guards near the door exchanged a glance, a small motion of their heads, that I would have missed if I had not been watching for exactly that kind of signal. The one at the console had gone very still, hands frozen above the amber controls. Only the first creature, the one who had spoken to me so gently when I woke, still looked at me the way it had from the start, with something closer to sympathy than suspicion. "I do not think she means harm," it said quietly, more to the dark-robed one than to me. "She is frightened. Frightened creatures often lash out with questions they cannot answer themselves." I let that comment sit for a moment before I answered it, because letting silence stretch was its own kind of pressure. "I'm not lashing out," I said. "I'm asking because the answer changes what happens next. If you're observers, then we can talk, and maybe this ends with both of us learning something useful. If you're not, then I'd rather know now than later." The dark-robed figure studied me for a long moment, its black eyes giving away nothing. Then it turned to the guards, and made a short, clipped sound that I did not need the implant to understand was an order. The two of them stepped forward, not aggressively, but with clear purpose, flanking either side of the pod. "You will come with me," the dark-robed figure said. "There are others who will want to speak with you directly." I let myself hesitate, just enough to look uncertain, before I climbed out of the pod on my own, refusing the hand one of the guards offered. My legs were unsteady beneath me, the low gravity making my first few steps clumsy. But I kept my chin level and my eyes moving, memorizing the layout of the chamber as we crossed it. 3 exits, a bank of consoles that likely controlled environmental systems, a narrow corridor branching off to the left that hummed with a different frequency than the rest of the ship, probably an engineering section. They led me through a wide door into a corridor lined with the same soft blue light as the chamber I had woken in, the walls curving gently overhead in a way that made the whole ship feel less like metal and more like something grown rather than built. We passed other Veil along the way, each one pausing to watch me as I walked past, their expressions unreadable, but their attention unmistakable. Word of the frightened creature who had asked a very unfrightened question was clearly already spreading. The corridor ended in a room far larger than the first, circular, with a raised platform at its center surrounded by seating that curved around it like the inside of a shell. Several more of the tall, pale figures were already gathered there, and as I was brought forward, their conversation stopped all at once, every dark eye turning toward me. "This is her," the dark-robed figure said, and I noted, quietly, that it had not used my name, because it did not have one to use. "Elena," I said, before anyone could ask, or decide not to ask at all. "My name is Elena." A ripple of something passed through the gathered figures, not quite surprise, but close to it, as if the simple act of offering my own name had shifted something in how they were looking at me. One of them, seated slightly apart from the others in a way that suggested authority without announcing it, leaned forward. Its robe was a deep violet, darker than any I had seen so far, and its voice, when it spoke, carried a weight the others had lacked. "I am Threll," it said. "I oversee this vessel. You asked my second whether we were here to observe your species, or to determine whether it should be ended. I would like to understand why a creature freshly recovered from the wreckage of a destroyed craft would think to ask such a thing." I met its gaze, and did not look away. "Because my people have learned to ask that question of everyone we meet," I said, "every single time, without exception. It's the first thing we teach our children, before we teach them to read, before we teach them to swim. Ask what the stranger wants, before you ask what they can give you." "That seems a grim way to raise a child," Threll said, and there was no judgment in its voice, only genuine curiosity, the tone of someone examining an unfamiliar artifact and trying to understand its purpose. "It's not grim," I said. It's honest. We didn't choose to be careful because we're cruel. We chose it because the alternative got a lot of us killed before we learned better. Threll was quiet for a long moment, its black eyes studying me with an intensity that made the room feel smaller than it was. Then it turned to the one who had first tended to me in the pod. Sella, it said, you believed her to be harmless. I believed her to be frightened, Sella said carefully. I still believe that. Fear and danger are not the same thing. No, Threll agreed slowly, its gaze returning to me. They are not. Tell me, Elena. If I asked you to prove to me that your people are not a danger, could you do it? I considered the question carefully before I answered, because I understood, even then, that whatever I said next would matter more than anything I had said so far. No, I said finally. I couldn't prove that to you, because it wouldn't be true. My people can be dangerous. We've had to be. What I can prove is that we don't have to be dangerous to you, if you don't give us a reason to be. The silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier, more considered. I watched Threll's hands, folded in its lap, tighten slightly at the knuckles, the only sign of tension in an otherwise composed posture. You speak as though you carry the authority of your entire species, Threll said. And yet you were found alone, in the wreckage of a single small craft, with no fleet, no signal, no evidence of anyone searching for you. That last part landed harder than I let myself show. I had not thought about it until Threll said it aloud, but it was true. No one had come looking. Not yet, at least, and I did not know, in that moment, whether that silence meant I had been lost, or whether it meant something else entirely, something I was not yet ready to consider. I don't carry the authority of anyone, I said. I'm just the only one of us you've met so far. That doesn't mean I'm the only one who matters, and it definitely doesn't mean I'm the only one who's paying attention to what happens here. Threll's eyes narrowed slightly, the first genuine crack of unease I had seen since entering the room. Are you suggesting we are being watched? It asked. I'm suggesting you should assume you might be, I said, the same way I assumed I might be walking into danger the moment I woke up in that pod. It's a simple rule. Assume the worst is possible until you have proof otherwise. It's not an insult, it's just good sense. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. I could feel the weight of every dark eye on me, weighing my words, searching my face for the tremor of a bluff. I kept my expression steady, though inside, my heart was working harder than I let it show. Because the truth was, I did not know if anyone was coming. I did not know if the silence outside this ship meant safety or abandonment, but I had learned long ago that certainty was a luxury you rarely had, and that the only thing you could really control was how well you hid the difference between what you knew and what you were only hoping. Sella finally broke the silence, its voice quieter than before, almost hesitant. Threll, it said, perhaps we should reconsider our approach. If her species truly raises its young to think this way, to question intent before trusting kindness, then we may be dealing with something far more organized than a single survivor. Or, said another voice from among the gathered figures, one that had not spoken before, sharp and skeptical, we are dealing with a frightened creature, who has learned to talk her way out of danger, and nothing more. I turned toward the voice and found a veil standing slightly apart from the rest, its robe a muted gray, its posture rigid in a way that read, even across species, as distrust. You're welcome to believe that, I said evenly. But ask yourself something. If I really were just a frightened creature, talking her way out of danger, wouldn't it still be useful to know the answer to my question? Are you here to observe, or are you here to decide whether we should be erased? Because if it's the second one, I'd rather you say so now, while I'm still just one person standing in front of you, instead of later, after you've made a decision my people will have to answer for. Threll rose slowly from its seat, its violet robe settling around it, as it took a step closer to the platform where I stood. You ask for honesty, it said. Very well. This vessel was sent to observe, to gather information on any developing species along this edge of unexplored space, and to report our findings to a larger fleet, one that will use those findings to decide how your kind should be approached, welcomed, or avoided, depending on what we determine. I let that settle for a moment before I answered. And if your report says we're dangerous, I said, what happens then? Threll did not answer right away, and in that hesitation, I found the answer I had been afraid of all along. Then decisions will be made, it said finally, that neither of us will have any say in. I nodded slowly, filing that answer away, feeling the shape of the situation settle into place, with a clarity that steadied me more than it frightened me. I was not just a survivor being studied. I was, whether I had asked for the role or not, the very first impression my entire species was about to make on a fleet capable of deciding our fate before we ever knew we had been judged. Then I suggest, I said quietly, you let me help you write that report. Threll did not answer immediately. It studied me the way someone studies a locked door, trying to decide whether the lock is worth picking or better left alone. Around the room, the other veil shifted, murmuring among themselves in that pressure language rhythm that my implant only caught in fragments, words like unusual and unprecedented rising out of the noise before fading again. You wish to help us decide the fate of your own species, Threll said finally. That is either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. Maybe it's both, I said, but it's also the only option that makes sense. You're going to write that report whether I help or not. The only question is whether it's accurate. The gray-robed skeptic, the one who had spoken against me earlier, made a short, dismissive sound. And how would we know your help was not simply a performance, crafted to make us believe what you wish us to believe? You wouldn't, I admitted. Not right away. But I don't think you're the kind of people who make decisions based on a single conversation. I think you check things. I think you verify. So verify me. That seemed to catch their attention in a way nothing else had. Threll's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, I saw something that looked almost like respect settle into its expression. Explain, it said. I took a slow breath, buying myself a second to choose my words carefully, because everything that came next would either build the fragile trust I had started to construct, or shatter it completely. You said this vessel is unarmed, I said. That it exists only to observe, but I've been walking through this ship for the better part of an hour, and I've noticed things that don't line up with that story. The room went very still again, the same stillness that had followed my first question, the one that had started all of this. Go on, Threll said, its voice carefully neutral. The corridor outside the chamber I woke in, I said. There's a section along the outer hull, just past the second junction, where the wall paneling has been replaced recently. Newer material, slightly different color, poorly matched to the surrounding hull. That kind of patchwork usually means something was installed there that wasn't part of the original design. On a research vessel, that might mean new sensors. It might also mean something else. Sella, standing near the edge of the platform, turned sharply toward Threll, its expression unreadable, but its posture rigid with sudden tension. And the restraints your guards carry, I continued, before anyone could interrupt. I noticed them the moment I woke up. They're not built for handling frightened or injured creatures. The joints are reinforced, the grip mechanisms designed for resistance, for something that might fight back. Research teams equip themselves to protect their specimens. They don't usually equip themselves to subdue them. The gray-robed veil took a step forward, its earlier skepticism replaced now by something sharper, closer to alarm. She has been conscious for less than an hour, and already she has mapped weaknesses in our security. I haven't mapped weaknesses, I said. I've noticed contradictions. There's a difference. You told me this ship exists to observe. Everything I've seen since I woke up tells a slightly different story, one where observation might not be the only purpose this vessel was built for. Threll was silent for a long moment, its violet robe catching the ambient light as it turned slowly toward Sella. Is what she says true? Sella hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. The hull modifications were completed before this vessel departed, Sella admitted quietly, as were the restraint systems. They were precautionary additions, authorized before we knew what kind of species we might encounter along this edge of space. Precautionary, I repeated. That's an interesting word for weapons and restraints installed before you'd even met us. They are not weapons, the gray-robed veil snapped, its composure finally cracking. They are defensive systems, authorized for any vessel operating beyond secured territory. It is standard procedure. For observers, I said quietly, or for something else. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if anyone in the room intended to answer at all. Threll finally stepped down from the raised platform, crossing the space between us until it stood close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to hold its gaze. "You want the truth," it said, its voice low. "Very well. This vessel was not sent merely to observe. It was sent as the forward eye of a much larger fleet, currently holding position beyond the edge of this system, awaiting our report before deciding whether to proceed further, to withdraw entirely, or to act preemptively against whatever threat your species might represent." There it was. The truth I had suspected since the moment I woke, and felt that unfamiliar ridge beneath my skin. I let it settle over me without flinching, because flinching now would undo every careful step I had taken to get to this exact moment. "How large a fleet?" I asked. "Large enough," Threll said, "that if the report from this vessel described your species as an immediate threat, the decision to act would not require lengthy deliberation." I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, but I kept my voice even. "And if the report described us as something worth understanding, instead of destroying?" "Then the fleet would hold position," Threll said. "Contact would proceed carefully, cautiously, over a much longer span of time. Trust would be built, if it could be built at all. So the entire future of first contact between our species," I said slowly, "depends on whatever this ship decides to write in a single report." "Yes," Threll said simply. I looked around the room, at Sella's uneasy posture, at the gray-robed Veil's guarded suspicion, at the handful of others watching me with expressions I still could not fully read, and I understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened me, exactly what was happening here. I was not being questioned by curious scientists anymore. I was standing at the exact point where two futures branched apart, and every word I spoke from here forward would help decide which one my species walked into. "Then you already have your answer," I said quietly. "You just don't like it." Threll tilted its head, the closest thing to confusion I had seen from it yet. "Explain." "You came here to observe," I said, "and you have. You've seen a species that trains its people to stay calm under pressure, to ask hard questions instead of panicking, to notice contradictions, and call them out, even when the odds are stacked against them. You've seen someone who woke up alone, outnumbered, and unarmed, and instead of begging for mercy, asked you to be honest. That's not a performance. That's exactly who we are. You already know what kind of species you're dealing with. You're just deciding whether you like the answer enough to write it down truthfully." The gray-robed Veil made a sharp sound, somewhere between disbelief and frustration. "You cannot possibly claim to represent your entire species based on your own behavior alone." "No," I agreed, "but I can tell you this. Whatever fleet is waiting out there, whatever decision they're preparing to make, my people have survived far worse threats than a ship full of cautious scientists deciding whether to be afraid of us. We didn't get this far by being reckless, and we didn't get this far by being weak. If your fleet decides we're a threat worth destroying, you'll find out very quickly just how wrong that decision was. And if your fleet decides we're worth understanding instead, you'll find something far more valuable than anything a report could ever capture." Threll studied me for a long moment, its black eyes searching my face, as though trying to read something written beneath the surface of my words. "You speak with a great deal of confidence for someone who does not know whether her own people are even searching for her." That struck closer to the truth than I wanted to admit, but I did not let it show. "Confidence isn't the same as certainty," I said. "I don't know if anyone is coming for me. I don't know if this ship is the only chance my species will ever get to make a good first impression. But I know what happens if I let fear make my decisions for me. I stop being useful. I stop being able to help either of us avoid a mistake neither side can take back." Sella stepped forward then, its earlier hesitance replaced by something more resolute. "Threll, I believe her. Not because I am certain she speaks the truth in every detail, but because everything she has done since waking has been consistent. She has not lied to protect herself. She has not begged. She has done nothing but ask us to be as honest as she has been." The gray-robed Veil turned toward Sella sharply. "You would risk the safety of this entire fleet on consistency alone." "I would risk it," Sella said, "on the understanding that the alternative, treating every unfamiliar species as a threat, before we have any real evidence, is exactly the kind of mistake that starts wars neither side ever wanted." Threll remained silent for a long moment, its gaze drifting from Sella to the gray-robed skeptic, and finally back to me. When it spoke again, Its voice carried a weight I had not heard from it before, something closer to genuine uncertainty than the careful authority it had shown until now. "If I allow you to help shape this report," it said slowly, "you understand that whatever you contribute will be scrutinized, verified, and tested against everything else we observe from this point forward. You will not be given blind trust. You will be given the chance to earn it." "That's all I was ever going to ask for," I said. Threll nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, and turned to address the rest of the room. "Then let it be understood. From this moment forward, this vessel's assessment of the human species will be conducted jointly, with Elena's full participation and full honesty required in return for the same from us. Any deception, from either side, ends this arrangement immediately, and the report defaults to the most cautious possible conclusion." A murmur passed through the gathered veil, some uneasy, some curious, but none openly opposed, not even the gray-robed skeptic, who simply crossed its arms and said nothing further. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, and for the first time since waking in that pod, I allowed myself to feel something other than calculation. Not quite relief, because the situation was still fragile, still balanced on a blade's edge that could tip either way with a single wrong move. But something close to hope, the quiet, cautious kind, that comes from realizing a door you thought was closed might still be open, if you were careful enough about how you walked through it. "Then let's get to work," I said, "because somewhere out there, a fleet is waiting to find out what kind of neighbors it's about to have. I'd rather they hear the truth from me than a rumor built from fear." Threll's black eyes held mine for a long moment, and in them, I thought I saw something shift. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of a question that had not existed in this room an hour ago. The question of whether the creature they had pulled from the wreckage of a shattered ship might turn out to be the very thing standing between two civilizations and a war neither of them could afford to fight. Work began almost immediately, and it did not look the way I expected. I had imagined something closer to an interrogation, questions fired at me one after another while I sat pinned beneath a bright light. Instead, Sella led me to a smaller chamber just off the main platform room, quieter, its walls lined with softly glowing panels that displayed shifting patterns of light I did not yet understand. "This is where the report will be compiled," Sella explained, gesturing toward a raised console at the center of the room. "Every observation, every conversation, every piece of evidence we gather about your species will be recorded here, then transmitted to the fleet once Threll authorizes the final version." "And I get to see what goes into it," I said. It was not quite a question. "You have earned that much, for now," Sella said. "Though I would caution you, access is not the same as control. The final decisions still rest with Threll, and beyond Threll, with the fleet itself." I nodded, filing that away. It was not the full trust I wanted, but it was more than I had an hour ago, and in my experience, most real progress happened in increments like that. Small doors opening one at a time, rather than all at once. Over the following hours, the questions came, but not in the way I had feared. Sella asked about simple things at first: how humans raised their children, how we organized our communities, what we valued enough to protect, and what we were willing to sacrifice for those values. I answered honestly, though carefully, choosing examples that showed strength without cruelty, caution without paranoia. I talked about how we built shelters not just to survive, but to remember those we had lost. I talked about how we taught our children to ask questions before accepting answers, not because we distrusted everyone, but because trust without understanding had cost us dearly in the past. Threll observed most of these conversations from a distance, saying little, though I noticed it recorded everything, its dark eyes narrowing slightly whenever I described something it clearly had not expected. When I explained that human children were taught self-defense alongside cooperation, its posture stiffened. When I explained that we valued curiosity as much as caution, encouraging our young to explore even the things that frightened them, something in its expression eased, just slightly. "Your species is a contradiction," Threll said at one point, breaking its long silence. "Cautious enough to question strangers before trusting them, yet curious enough to explore the very things that endanger you. That's not a contradiction," I said. "That's balance. Caution without curiosity makes you stagnant. Curiosity without caution gets you killed." We learned a long time ago that you need both, or you don't survive long enough to matter. Threll considered that for a long moment before responding. A dangerous balance to maintain. Most useful things are dangerous to maintain, I said. That doesn't mean they're not worth maintaining. The gray-robed Veil, whose name I finally learned was Korov, remained the most resistant presence in the room throughout these sessions, watching every exchange with narrowed eyes, occasionally interjecting with sharp, pointed questions, clearly designed to catch me in a contradiction or an exaggeration. I welcomed each one, because every honest answer I gave, especially the ones that did not flatter my own species, seemed to chip away slightly at his suspicion. You admit your people have fought wars among yourselves, Korov said during one such exchange, his tone almost accusatory. Species who cannot maintain peace within their own ranks are rarely peaceful toward outsiders. We have fought wars, I agreed. I won't pretend otherwise, because you'd find out eventually, and then you'd have every reason to stop trusting anything else I told you. But most of those wars taught us exactly the lesson I've been describing. Fear and pride cost us more than any enemy ever did. We're not perfect, Korov. We're not asking you to believe we are. We're asking you to judge us by what we do now, not by every mistake we've ever made trying to figure out how to survive. Korov did not respond immediately, but something in his rigid posture eased, just slightly, and he did not raise the point again. As the hours passed, I began to notice something else, something I had not expected when this arrangement began. The Veil were not simply gathering information to judge us. They were, in their own careful, cautious way, trying to understand us, genuinely curious about a species so different from their own, and yet, in certain fundamental ways, uncomfortably similar. Sela, in particular, seemed to soften, with every conversation, asking questions that grew less clinical and more personal as time went on. "Do you have a family?" Sela asked at one point, during a lull between more formal questions. "Somewhere out there, waiting for you?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was the first one asked, with no strategic purpose behind it. Simply curiosity, simply care. "A brother," I said quietly, "younger than me. He doesn't know what happened to my ship. He probably thinks I'm still on a routine assignment, out of contact for a few more weeks before I'm due back." "And when you do not return on schedule," Sela asked gently, "what will he do?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering, because it was a question I had been avoiding since I first woke in that pod. "He'll assume the worst," I said finally. "And he'll be right to. My people don't wait quietly when someone doesn't come home. We look. We keep looking, longer than most would consider reasonable, because giving up on someone too early is a mistake we've made before, and paid for." Something flickered across Sela's expression, something that looked almost like sorrow. "Then it is likely your people are already searching for you." "Probably," I admitted. "Which means whatever decision your fleet makes about us, they're going to make it soon. One way or another. Either my people find this ship, and this becomes the first real conversation between our species, or they don't find it in time, and it becomes something else entirely." The room went quiet at that, the weight of the statement settling over everyone present. Even Threll, who had remained largely composed throughout every difficult exchange so far, seemed to absorb the implication fully for the first time. "How long," Threll asked finally, "before your people would consider search efforts?" "Urgent?" I did the math in my head, counting back through what little I could piece together about how long I had been unconscious, how long my ship had likely drifted before the Veil found it, how long standard protocol allowed before a missing vessel was escalated from routine concern to active search. "Days," I said. "Maybe less. And if they do find this ship before your fleet makes its decision, I need you to understand something. My people won't come quietly, and they won't come alone. If they think I've been taken, if they think I might be in danger, they will not treat this as a diplomatic visit. They'll treat it exactly the way I did when I woke up in that pod, cautiously, prepared for the worst, ready to defend, not to negotiate, unless someone gives them a reason to believe negotiation is even possible." Korov's earlier suspicion flared back to life at that, sharp and immediate. "You are threatening us." "I'm warning you," I said, my voice steady, deliberate. "There's a difference, and it's the same difference I asked Threll about the moment I woke up on this ship. I'm not telling you my people will come here to destroy you." I'm telling you they'll come here prepared for that possibility, the same way I was, because that's how we survive. Whether that preparation turns into conflict, or turns into something better, depends entirely on what they find when they arrive, and what kind of impression this ship has already made by then. Threll rose slowly from where it had been seated, its violet robe settling around it as it crossed toward the console at the center of the room, its expression unreadable, but its movements carrying a new urgency that had not been there before. Then we no longer have the luxury of a slow, careful assessment, Threll said quietly, more to itself than to anyone else in the room. If her people are already searching, if they may arrive before the fleet reaches a final decision, then the report we compile in the coming hours may be the only thing standing between a peaceful first meeting and a conflict none of us are prepared for. I felt the weight of that settle over me too, heavier than anything I had carried since waking in that pod. This was no longer simply about proving my own worth, or even the worth of my species, in the abstract. This was about time, about a clock I could not see ticking down somewhere beyond the walls of this ship, counting toward a moment that would define everything that came after it. Then we'd better make sure the report is honest, I said, and we'd better make sure it's finished before that clock runs out. Threll turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had woken aboard this vessel, I saw something in its expression that looked less like careful observation and more like genuine, shared urgency. Agreed, it said. Let us finish what we started, Elena. Quickly and truthfully, because I do not believe either of our species can afford anything less. We worked through what should have been night, though there was no true night aboard a ship that measured time only in shift rotations and the steady pulse of its engines. Sella brought food I did not recognize but ate anyway, small pale strips that tasted faintly of something sweet and green, and Korov, despite his lingering distrust, began contributing questions that felt less like traps and more like genuine attempts to understand. But as the hours passed, I grew aware of something else, a pressure building quietly beneath the surface of every conversation. Threll checked the console more often than before, its expression tightening slightly each time, though it said nothing about what it saw there. "What is it?" I finally asked, during a pause between questions. "You keep looking at that display like it's telling you something you don't want to hear." Threll hesitated, then turned the console slightly, so I could see the shifting patterns of light across its surface, though they meant nothing to me without translation. "The fleet has requested a status update," Threll said, "sooner than originally scheduled. They are aware this vessel encountered a survivor, and they are impatient for our assessment." "How impatient?" I asked. "Impatient enough," Threll said carefully, "that if we do not provide a satisfactory report within the next several hours, they may choose to proceed with a more cautious posture, regardless of what we eventually conclude." I understood immediately what that meant, and the cold weight that had settled in my stomach earlier returned, heavier this time. A more cautious posture, from a fleet-holding position beyond the edge of this system, could mean any number of things, none of them good, and all of them decided without my people ever having the chance to explain themselves. "Then we need to do more than just finish a report," I said. "We need to give them something they can't dismiss, something that proves what I've been telling you, not just in words, but in a way they can verify themselves." Sella looked between Threll and me, uncertainty flickering across its expression. "What do you propose?" I thought about it carefully before answering, because what I was about to suggest carried real risk, not just for me, but for whatever fragile trust had been built in this room over the past several hours. "Let me send a message," I said. "Not to your fleet, to mine. If my people are searching for me, and I believe they are, then a clear, honest signal, something that proves I'm alive and being treated fairly, might do more to prevent conflict than any report ever could. It shows both sides exactly what's happening here, instead of leaving either of us to guess." Korov's suspicion flared immediately. "You wish to contact your own fleet, from aboard this vessel. You understand how that could be perceived." "I understand exactly how it could be perceived," I said, "as a trap, or as a rescue signal designed to bring an armed response down on this ship. That's exactly why it needs to be done carefully, and honestly, with both of you watching every part of it. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to let me prove that a peaceful outcome is possible, using tools you can verify every step of the way." Threll was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request with the same careful deliberation it had shown since the beginning. Finally it nodded, slowly. "You may send a signal," Threll said, "but it will be transmitted through our systems, monitored fully, and any content beyond what we agree upon in advance will end this cooperation immediately." "That's fair," I said, and I meant it. We spent the next hour crafting the message together, word by word. Each phrase debated and refined, until it said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. I described my situation honestly, that I had survived the destruction of my ship, that I had been recovered by a vessel belonging to a species called the Veil, that I was being treated fairly, and that any response should proceed with caution, but not with hostility, because the crew of this vessel had shown no intention of causing harm. I did not soften the situation. I did not pretend everything was simple or without risk. I described the fleet waiting beyond the system's edge, the tension of an assessment being made in real time, the narrow window we were all operating within. My people needed the truth, not reassurance, if they were going to make the right decision when they arrived. Threll authorized the transmission personally, and I watched as the signal was prepared, encoded, and sent out into the dark beyond the ship's hull, carrying with it not just information, but the first real test of whether honesty could hold two very different species together long enough to avoid a mistake neither of us could take back. "Now we wait," Sella said quietly, once the transmission had gone out. Waiting, I discovered, was its own kind of test. The hours that followed stretched long and tense, filled with small talk that never quite masked the weight hanging over the room. Korov paced near the console, checking it periodically, though there was nothing new to check yet. Sella asked me quiet, careful questions about human customs that had nothing to do with the report, questions that felt, more and more, like genuine curiosity, rather than obligation. Threll remained mostly silent, its attention split between the console and the door, as if expecting either good news or bad to arrive at any moment. It was during one of these quiet stretches that something happened I had not expected at all. A soft chime sounded from a different console, one I had not noticed before, tucked into a corner of the room near a bank of storage compartments. Sella moved toward it immediately, its posture shifting from curious to alert in an instant. "What is that?" I asked. "A proximity signal," Sella said, studying the display carefully. "Something small, drifting near the outer hull. It appears to have activated only recently." Threll crossed the room quickly, its earlier composure giving way to something sharper, more focused. "Show me." The display shifted, revealing a faint outline, small and irregular, tumbling slowly through the dark, just beyond the ship's outer sensors. My breath caught as I recognized the shape, even distorted by distance and the crude resolution of the display. "That's from my ship," I said quietly. "That's my ship's flight recorder." Threll turned toward me sharply. "You are certain?" "I'm certain," I said, and something cold and strange settled over me as I studied the display more closely. But that shouldn't be possible. Flight recorders are built to stay with the wreckage, or eject only under very specific emergency conditions. If it's out there now, active, sending a signal, that means either something triggered it long after the crash, or... I stopped myself, the implications settling into place slowly, uncomfortably. "Or it was placed there deliberately," Sella finished quietly. "Activated recently, rather than during whatever event destroyed your ship." I stared at the display, my mind working quickly through possibilities I had not allowed myself to consider until now. If the recorder had only activated recently, it meant someone, or something, had accessed it after the crash, long after I had been unconscious aboard this vessel. It meant I had not simply drifted here by accident. It meant someone had known where I was, and had left behind something meant to be found. "I need to see that," I said. "Now." Threll hesitated only a moment before nodding to one of the guards stationed near the door. "Retrieve it, carefully, and bring it directly here." The wait that followed felt longer than any of the hours before it, though in truth it was only minutes before the guard returned, carrying a small, scorched device that I recognized immediately, despite the damage it had taken. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, running my fingers over the familiar casing, searching for the access panel I knew should be there. "This is a standard flight recorder," I said, more to myself than to the room. "But it's been modified. This housing isn't original. Someone attached an external transmitter to it, after the crash." "Can you access what it recorded?" Threll asked. I studied the panel carefully, my training coming back to me in fragments, as I worked through the sequence of steps needed to interface with a device never meant to be opened outside a proper recovery facility. It took several attempts, and more than a little improvisation, but finally, the small display embedded in the recorder's casing flickered to life, revealing lines of text and data that made my chest tighten with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "This wasn't a random crash," I said slowly, reading through the data as it scrolled past. "This device was left here deliberately, as a listening post. My people didn't just lose contact with me. They placed this recorder here on purpose, set to activate and transmit once certain conditions were met, conditions that were only satisfied recently." "What conditions?" Sella asked, its voice quiet, with something that sounded almost like awe. I looked up from the display, meeting Threll's gaze directly, understanding settling over me with a clarity that changed everything I had believed about my situation since waking in that pod. "Confirmed contact with another species," I said. "This recorder was set to stay dormant until it detected exactly what's happening right now. A human in direct communication with an unknown alien vessel, which means my ship's crash wasn't random, and I wasn't simply found by accident." Threll's expression shifted slowly from confusion to something far more careful, far more cautious than anything I had seen from it before. "You are suggesting," Threll said slowly, "that your presence here was intentional, that you were placed in this position deliberately." "I'm suggesting," I said, "that my people have been more careful about this entire situation than either of us realized. Somewhere between the moment my ship was damaged and the moment I woke up aboard your vessel, someone made a decision to turn what could have been a disaster into an opportunity. And that recorder just confirmed it's already transmitting everything it's recorded, straight back to whoever's been waiting to hear from it." The room fell silent, the weight of that realization settling over everyone present. I was no longer simply a survivor being studied by cautious observers, nor even a voluntary participant helping shape a report meant to prevent conflict. I understood now, exactly what I had been from the very beginning, whether I had known it or not. A listening post of my own, placed carefully into the heart of an uncertain situation, watching everything unfold from the inside, while my own people waited quietly beyond the dark, gathering everything they needed to know before deciding how, and whether, to make their presence known. "Then it seems," Threll said quietly, "that neither of us has been entirely what the other believed." "No," I agreed, setting the recorder down carefully on the console beside me. "I don't think we have." The revelation of the recorder changed the atmosphere aboard the ship in ways I could feel almost immediately. Where before there had been careful curiosity mixed with lingering suspicion, now there was something closer to genuine unease, the kind that comes from realizing you have understood only half of a situation you believed you had fully grasped. Korav, in particular, seemed rattled in a way I had not seen from him before, his rigid composure cracking as he studied the recorder's data over my shoulder. "If your people already knew this vessel would find you," he said, his voice tight, "then everything that has happened here, every question, every answer, every moment of trust we have built, has been observed from the very beginning." "Not observed the way you're imagining," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I was not entirely certain that was true. "This recorder collects data. It doesn't broadcast a live feed. Whatever it's recorded is only reaching my people now, in this transmission, not as it happened." "That is little comfort," Korav muttered, though the sharpness in his voice had shifted toward something closer to genuine anxiety than accusation. Threll, for its part, remained remarkably composed, though I could see the careful calculation working behind its dark eyes as it processed the new information. "The transmission from the recorder," it said finally. "How long before your people receive it, and how long before we might expect a response?" I studied the recorder's display again, working through the technical details as best I could, given the damage it had sustained. Hard to say exactly, but if this was designed as a contingency system, something meant to activate under very specific conditions, then I'd guess my people built it to transmit quickly, and to prioritize speed over subtlety, which means they'll know what's happening here soon, very soon. As if summoned by my own words, the ship's alert system chimed suddenly, sharp and insistent, cutting through the tense quiet of the room. Threll moved immediately to the main console, its earlier composure giving way to something closer to controlled urgency, as data scrolled rapidly across the display. "Multiple contacts," Threll said, approaching from beyond the system's edge, moving with purpose, not drifting. My heart began to race, though I forced myself to keep my breathing steady, my posture calm, even as every instinct urged me toward panic. How many? 6, Threll said, studying the display closely. Configuration suggests a small, organized formation, not a full invasion force, but not a single scout vessel either. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing exactly what kind of formation that likely represented. A rapid response group, built for speed and coordination rather than overwhelming force. Exactly the kind of formation my people would send when searching for a missing operative under uncertain circumstances. That's a search and recovery formation, I said, not an invasion fleet. If they wanted to attack, they'd have sent something much larger, and they wouldn't have announced themselves this clearly on approach. You sound certain, Threll said, though there was no accusation in its tone now, only careful attention. I'm as certain as I can be, I said, but certainty isn't the same as safety. If your fleet reacts to their approach the same way you might have reacted to me when I first woke up here, assuming the worst before giving anyone the chance to explain, this could go wrong very quickly, for both sides. Threll turned toward me sharply. You believe I should recommend restraint to a fleet already prepared to act with caution against an unknown threat? I believe, I said, that you have exactly the same opportunity right now that I had when I woke up in that pod. You can choose to assume the worst and guarantee a confrontation neither of us wants, or you can choose to trust the report we've built together over these past hours and give both sides a real chance to prove what kind of first contact this is going to be. The room fell into a tense, considering silence. I could see the weight of the decision settling over Threll, the responsibility of not just its own judgment, but the judgment of an entire fleet waiting on its recommendation. If I am wrong, Threll said quietly, the consequences will fall not just on this vessel, but on my entire species' relationship with yours, for generations to come. If either of us had let fear make our decisions from the start, I said, we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation at all. We'd already be enemies, and neither side would ever know how close we came to something better. Threll held my gaze for a long moment, something passing between us that felt, for the first time, less like careful negotiation and genuine, mutual respect. Then it turned back to the console and began composing a message, its hands moving quickly and deliberately across the controls. I am recommending, Threll said, speaking aloud as it worked, that the approaching formation be allowed to close distance without interference, and that this vessel transmit the full report compiled over these past hours, ahead of any direct contact, so that both fleets understand the situation before any decision is made that cannot be undone. Thank you, I said quietly. Do not thank me yet, Threll said. This decision is not mine alone to enforce. The fleet may choose to disregard my recommendation entirely. We did not have long to wait for an answer. Within the hour, the 6 approaching vessels had closed enough distance to be visible directly through the ship's viewport, sleek and quick, their configuration unmistakably human, in design even from a distance, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly at the familiar sight, a piece of home suddenly visible after what felt like days spent entirely among strangers. They are holding position, Threll observed, studying the display closely. Not advancing further, waiting. That's a good sign, I said. It means they received the report, and they're giving you the chance to respond before making any further move. A new signal chimed through the room moments later, different from the alert before, and Threll's eyes widened slightly as it processed the incoming transmission. They are requesting direct communication, Threll said. With you specifically. My breath caught, and for a moment, all the careful composure I had maintained since waking in that pod threatened to slip entirely, replaced by something rawer, more immediate. Let me speak with them. Threll gestured toward the console, and Sella moved quickly to adjust the settings, routing the incoming transmission through a smaller display positioned close enough for me to see clearly. A moment later, a familiar voice filled the room, steady and controlled, though I could hear beneath its careful composure the same relief I felt rising in my own chest. Elena, the voice said, this is Commander Priya Anand, aboard the recovery vessel Wayfinder. Please confirm your status. I'm alive, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Unharmed, being treated fairly by the crew of this vessel. Commander, I need you to listen carefully, because what happens in the next few minutes matters more than just my own recovery." "We received the full transmission," Priya said. "Threll's report and your message before it. We've reviewed everything. Command back home has already begun discussing the implications, but the decision on how to proceed here, in this exact moment, falls to me." "Then I need you to trust what you read," I said. "This isn't a trap, and it isn't a rescue from captivity. This is a species that had every advantage over me the moment I woke up here, and chose caution and honesty instead of exploiting it. If we want any chance at a real, lasting relationship with them, it starts with how we handle the next few minutes." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I could feel Threll and the others in the room holding their breath alongside me, waiting to hear what judgment my own people would render. "Understood," Priya said finally, requesting permission to send a single small craft to dock directly, unarmed, for a face-to-face meeting. "No larger action will be taken, unless that meeting suggests otherwise." I looked toward Threll, silently asking the question I did not need to voice aloud. "Permission granted," Threll said, its voice carrying clearly through the open transmission. "We will prepare a docking bay immediately." The next several minutes passed in a blur of quiet activity, the ship's crew preparing carefully for the arrival of the small human craft, while I found myself standing near the docking bay entrance, Sela close beside me, Threll and Korov a few steps further back, their postures carrying the same careful tension I remembered feeling myself when I first woke aboard this vessel. When the docking bay doors finally opened, revealing the small craft settled quietly within, and the hatch hissed open to release a single figure in a simple flight suit, I felt something in my chest finally unclench completely. Commander Anand stepped through slowly, her eyes scanning the room with the same careful, practiced awareness I recognized instantly, the same training I had relied on since the moment I woke up here. Her gaze found me first, and for just a moment, the careful composure of command slipped, replaced by something more personal, more relieved. "You look tired," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking through her professional calm. "I've had a long few days," I admitted. Priya's attention shifted then to Threll, her posture straightening again, into something more formal, though not unfriendly. "Threll, I presume?" "I am," Threll said, "and you have my gratitude, Commander, for your restraint in these past hours. It could not have been an easy decision." "It wasn't," Priya said honestly, "but it was the right one, based on what Elena sent us, and based on what your own report described. I've read a lot of first contact protocols in my career. I've never read one quite like this." "Perhaps," Threll said, "that is because this was never a typical first contact. Elena made certain of that, from the very first question she asked upon waking aboard this vessel." Priya glanced toward me, curiosity flickering across her expression. What question was that? I felt a small, tired smile tug at the corner of my mouth as I answered. I asked them whether they were here to observe us, or to decide whether we were worth destroying. Seemed like the only question worth asking, under the circumstances. Priya studied me for a long moment, then let out a short, surprised laugh, shaking her head slightly. "Only you would wake up alone on an alien ship, and immediately start interrogating your captors, instead of panicking." "I wasn't captured," I said. "I was observed. There's a difference, and it took a while for both sides to figure out which one this actually was." The negotiations that followed over the next several hours were, in many ways, an extension of everything that had already happened between myself and Threll's crew. Careful, deliberate, built on honesty rather than assumption. Commander Anand and Threll worked together to establish the first formal framework for continued contact between our species. Cautious steps rather than sweeping declarations, but steps built on a foundation neither side had expected to find so quickly. Trust earned rather than assumed, tested rather than simply hoped for. Near the end of those long hours, as the framework for future contact was finally taking shape, Threll approached me quietly, away from the rest of the ongoing discussion, its dark eyes carrying an expression I had come to recognize over the course of our strange, accelerated acquaintance, something between respect and quiet curiosity. "When this vessel first recovered you," Threll said, "we believed we had found something fragile, something trapped and helpless amid the wreckage of a destroyed craft. It has taken me a great many hours to understand how completely mistaken that assumption was." "You weren't entirely wrong," I said. I was trapped in a way. Just not the way you thought. I was trapped in a situation where the only way out was to make you understand exactly what you were dealing with, before you decided what to do about it. And now that we understand, Threll asked, what do you believe happens next? I considered the question carefully, looking past Threll toward where Commander Anand and Sella were finishing the last details of the agreement that would carry back to both our fleets, the first real bridge between two species who had begun this encounter, prepared to assume the worst of one another. Now, I said, we find out whether understanding is enough to build something real, whether being careful with each other from the start means we can eventually stop being quite so careful and start actually being neighbors. Threll was quiet for a long moment, considering that, before offering something I had not expected from it since the very beginning of our encounter, a small, deliberate bow of respect, an acknowledgement that transcended the careful formality that had defined every interaction between us until now. Then I look forward to finding out, it said, alongside you. As the docking bay doors finally opened again, preparing for my own departure back toward the Wayfinder and the long journey home that would follow, I paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the ship that had begun as a place of uncertainty and fear, and had become, against every expectation I carried when I first woke inside that quiet blue pod, the starting point of something far larger than either of us had anticipated. They had believed, in the beginning, that they had found a frightened, trapped creature, small and helpless, amid the ruins of a shattered ship. What they found instead was someone who understood, long before they did, that the only real question worth asking, in that first uncertain moment, was never about fear, or fragility, or captivity at all. It had only ever been about which future both sides were willing to choose, whether we would meet each other as targets, prepared only to strike first out of fear, or as observers, patient enough to understand before deciding, and brave enough to be honest about what we found. I stepped through the hatch and into the quiet dark beyond, carrying that answer home with me, not as a captive rescued from danger, but as the first voice of an entire species that had just proven, in the most uncertain circumstances imaginable, that it was capable of choosing understanding over fear, even when fear would have been so much easier to justify. They had thought I was trapped. I had simply been waiting to find out exactly what kind of future we were all about to choose,